2019. The human race is under attack by decisions. As engineers, we're haunted by technical decisions every day. We must focus to survive decisions by reframing the problem and explore options knowing we still have biases in order to reach a decision that optimally solves our problem. And become wizards in decision making. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Carl Chesser. I'm an engineer in the Platform Engineering Group, which is now part of the Shared Services Engineering organization. I'm here to talk about decisions, the pursuit of options. In this talk, I want to share some of the experiences I've had over my career at Cerner and as an engineer that has been very tough, and that is making decisions. We have found that there's been many struggles when it comes to decision making, and I found that there's a lot of things I have learned by observing how other people deal with decisions. This talk is going to follow a very specific method, the WHS method, which I pronounce as the WISH method. First, we'll start with why. Why are these decisions difficult to deal with? And then how? How are we going to implement and apply things through it? This talk is organized in things that are like cue cards that will kind of help identify challenges that come with decisions and how you can address and make decision making easier in your life. This talk is also not formed around common decision making frameworks. It's more around things you'll identify with decisions that make it tough with technical decisions. So let's start with the why. Why are we having a talk about decision making at a technical conference like DevCon? First, there's a big challenge with decisions. We face this all the time, especially in our personal life, where there's option overload. There's tons of options in front of us, and as humans, we have difficulty making decisions when there's so many options presented to us. Many times will see this even when you go to the grocery store to get your favorite can of beans. We also are not very good at predicting the future. We wish we had time machines that allow us to explore into space and understand exactly what may come out as a result. But when we can't predict the future very well, that uncertainty adds a lot of stress. And that stress gets boiled down to a very focal point of the decision we're going to make, because it will make a course correction in where we may go. By us not being able to predict the future, decisions add much more stress and highlight the pain they cause in our lives. Another challenge, which goes with the option overload, is that everyone has solutions. We'll talk about this later, but we'll see how there's a problem when we look at technical choices. We're normally evaluating what the problem is and then trying to find a solution as our choice in the decision. Everyone's advertising that they have solutions, and their solutions to your problems cure all your problems. And it becomes very difficult to navigate this space because you'll find that a solution may not be the best solution for your problem, but we get lost in their large feature set that they offer. All of them sound attractive and desirable to have, but perhaps it's not the best decision simply because everyone has solutions and they're all out there for sale. Next, if we have this desire to try to get adaptable solutions, we want to make a choice that makes it easier for us to change in the future. We understand that we can't predict the future and things will change. If things change, I want my choices to change as well. But we put all this pressure and stress on us knowing that, the decision might be really hard for us to revert. And if it's hard for us to revert, it makes a lot more stress into our lives. So this pursuit to get a option or choice that can change over time seems hard because we focus a lot on all the ramifications from one single choice. And also we're forced with this view as engineers, especially when it comes to feasibility, to seek both short and long-term gains in our choices. We're normally always faced with trying to deliver early results. This is a common strain that we have in software development. We came with things on the agile processes of doing sprints, and we're always sprinting. I've never went to a walk review or a mild pace jog review. We're sprinting all the time, and you're going to keep delivering at a fast pace. Well, in that framing, we normally look at options and what do we get in the short-term gain. Those who care much about their software are always looking to the long-term gain. How can I make a decision that fulfills both of these concerns? So those are some of the things that I think help categorize why decision-making can be hard, especially in the technical space. While there's many different things that influence and why technical decision is hard, those are some of the characteristics that I see as been challenging. So how do we try to address this? First is a problem of what we normally have with the technical problems. Before we get into making a decision, what is the problem we're trying to solve, or what is the choices that we're going to evaluate for that problem? A common issue we've had is when we see a problem, we normally see the signals of the problem, essentially the specific case that something happened. The software crashed in this unique way. We don't normally just try to solve how do you fix this one specific crash. Why does my software have this trend of crashes within it? That takes a larger, deep thought process to understand the underarching or underlying problem. Therefore, before we get into decisions of how to solve something, you don't want to rapidly jump into solutions to make a choice. You want to understand the problem, because most of the problems we're faced is just the signal, is not the underlying core influencers of the problem. To do this, I usually say, try to think about how to speak in more abstract terms. If you're describing the problem in many concrete cases of this one case happening, step back and try to just describe it a little more in an abstract way, because it might highlight the theme of the underlying problem that you actually need to decide how to solve. One way going about this is around problem framing or problem reframing. It's very easy for us to, with our laser focus, attach to what the problem is and say, here's the problem, now let's jump into the solution space and make a decision on how to solve that problem. A good practice to start doing is called problem reframing. There's a great article in the Harvard Business Review on this topic. To do this, you want to look at the problem in a different way and kind of bring more of a diverse picture into it to really question, what is the problem here? Because maybe what you're describing is not the problem. So here's a few. In this article, there are 7 points that you can kind of apply in a meeting to understand and discuss more about making a decision. But here's 3 of them I thought would be helpful to share. 1, bring outsiders into the discussion. These sometimes can be labeled as boundary spanners. When they get to hear how this problem is being described, they'll many times bring in a different perspective of like, wait a minute, why are we jumping to this final conclusion and that's the problem? There actually could be several things that's the issue with the problem you're describing. You also want to get people's definition in writing of what the problem is. I can't tell you how many times I've been in meetings where we say, here's the problem, and everyone seems like they're in agreement with what the problem is. You get deep into some discussion, you think you make progress, and then you realize you're talking about 2 slightly different problems, and the solutions totally are dependent on this difference of opinions. What you want to get out of it is, what are we all agreeing the problem is? And put it in writing and make sure people help refine exactly what the problem is. It really eradicates all this unnecessary communication challenges. And the last part about this is ask what's missing. When you come into a discussion, they're talking about a problem, it's very easy to go ahead and assume that we all have the information up to date, as well as, if you're someone who's not as well informed, you don't feel really well empowered to ask, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound quite right. Do we have all the information that's possible? It's normally good to always inject that question in, because it'll help people seek and probe, well, wait a minute, did we gather all the data from production to actually know how big of an impact it was? Maybe it wasn't an impact at all. One example I usually like to highlight has been if you think about a user experience, and let's say there's a save button in the bottom right-hand corner, and there's all these fields you fill out. You'll find that a user interaction suffers because after they fill in all the fields, they must scroll down to the bottom right to click save. And they find that they should move that button to the upper right. Therefore, they don't have to scroll. It's right there, immediate, so it's easy click. Now it's around how do we make the choices of where the actual button placement and changing that code. But if you try to reframe it, the reframing would be like, why are we having to scroll down to click a button? Why are we clicking a button to save? Why aren't we just auto-saving as you type and adjust that the challenges with making any changes in the form? That's around asking, why do we even have this? Maybe the event shouldn't be a human trigger to click. It's an actual background event in the system because something changed in the data. Problem and solution spaces. This is a dangerous kind of game when we're making technical decisions, much just because we have kind of two realms we're living in. One is helping identify what the problem actually is, so you know where you're at in that problem. That goes around how we identify what the problem is that we're discussing in that reframing exercise. And knowing that there's also a solution space, the options in which how you would solve these problems. It's extremely easy, especially with highly experienced people, to jump immediately in the solution space and start swimming around and enjoying it very much. This is great, I already got all these solutions to all these common problems. What you want to avoid is that you'll get lost in the solution space because of some of the things we'll talk about later and what I briefly mentioned at the beginning of why decisions are hard. There's a bunch of solutions out there and they're rich with features. And you think by getting more features, you've already reached what you needed versus are we solving the right problem? So in this point, you're going back to that problem reframing aspect of have it in writing. What is the problem we're trying to solve? So once you find out you're in the solution space and you're evaluating options, you understand what you're looking at is the right thing you're trying to solve. It's this one problem. It isn't, oh, we have this problem, plus this provides a logging abstraction, a data metrics collection, all these other great things that I would love. No, don't focus on that. Focus first that you are solving the problem at hand so you don't get lost in this solution space. There's a great blog post about this, about technical decision making by Cindy. She goes by Copy Construct that I'll reference here later that highlights this very problem well. Another great resource on this is about thinking fast and slow. Dr. Daniel Kahneman has kind of earned the Nobel Prize in economics in this space because of the works highlighted in this book. But he kind of shares two ways of thinking. One is called the System 1 and System 2 thinking in the brain. Now don't think about this as just like certain parts in your brain. It's the overall system how your brain's making decisions. System 1 is kind of that automatic low effort that can easily kind of make decisions but also result in wrong conclusions. You are actually making hundreds of decisions every day. System 1 thinking is doing a lot of that for you. You don't have to do a lot of work, right? It's automatically doing it for you. System 2 is more of attention, requires effort and complex kind of computations. System 2 is something that normally will kick in when System 1 fails. Essentially when System 1 doesn't understand what's going on. Like, wait a minute, I haven't encountered this before. This seems quite weird, or it kind of hit this cognitive dissonance. This doesn't make sense to me. The reason I bring this up is that we'll reference this as we go along to understand that System 1 is making lots of decisions for you, but it's highly influenced by biases. These biases are extremely hard to control, but I think one thing that's important is to understand these biases exist, and that when you're in System 1, it's taking control and making a lot of those choices based on it. Also, as engineers, we do a lot of things that we call as pattern matching. When we look at something, we quickly assess, oh, I've seen that problem before, it's this, and you quickly jump into what solution options that you're going to make a decision on. That a lot of times is influenced by your System 1 thinking. You're kind of looking at something like, I've seen this before, it's that. Try doing that problem reframing, which makes you go more into Systems 2 mode of thinking and challenging. Is that really what I've seen before? Because you're going to normally do things quick and make a quick adjustment and say, I know that, and go with it. We're good at pattern matching, especially the more experiences you get. You'll hear this many times when someone's like, yeah, I've seen this before. At my last job, we saw that and we solved it this way. That may be true, but this is probably a little bit more of a unique scenario that wouldn't have that same solution. So let's question first, how relatable is this to that past experience? So I will highlight certain biases as we talk along. You'll see the black banner bias at the bottom, which should call out one signal. One is our appeal to novelty. Newer things appear more valuable than others, even though all the features are the same, except one is just slightly newer than the other. As engineers, we are at high risk of this because we're working with technology, and technology is normally always having a different, shinier, or more marketable kind of skin to it, and it looks great, has better bells and whistles. Look at this beautiful Twitter Bootstrap page it has about this open source project. Though it has all the same features, it only has one maintainer that is not really involved in the project anymore versus this other boring project that's been around for 20 years. So be mindful of this, that when you start evaluating options, you're naturally going to jump to the conclusion of what is new and shinier, and you may want to be looking for what is the boring, stable, well-defined approach when it comes to looking for options on that decision. The availability heuristic. This is something that can also be quite dangerous when it comes to making decisions. What things seem available to you or within reach are normally the first things that come to mind as an option to make a decision. What is to highlight with this is that any other option in your perspective that is not available is at a significant disadvantage. So when this is usually highlighted with people who are on the same team for quite some time, they all write in the same programming language or use the same framework, they will see how that language and framework can solve all their problems, and they'll use that in that case. Well, you can just do it with here, it works quite well. Even though that problem could be better solved with possibly a different language or framework. The way to combat this is try to have diverse backgrounds in your decision making. This goes back to how to inject other people into your kind of decision-making scenarios, your meetings, or even type of conversations to make sure that what seems available to you isn't necessarily the only option. The other thing you should do is do what you're doing right now. Going to conferences, hearing other talks, listening to what other people's perspectives are. A third option I've always liked seeing now is what we do at Cerner with Ship It. You can start a project and get involved with the team and try a bunch of things in a really rich, deep, immersed experience and find out, wow, it's much easier than I thought we could do it. I mean, it was a lot of hard work, but that was really within reach that I didn't think was within reach before at my experience at this company. Another thing to go through as you're looking at options is understand that there's this usual view of explore versus exploit trade-offs. When you're looking at options, you're normally first assessing what is something you're familiar with. So the explore versus exploit is that with exploit, you're going to go with the things you know with and that you can just reliably use. Normally, this is the default option you'll always go with when time is unconstrained. Versus if you have a lot of time, you'll probably explore and go around and try stuff. So the example is if you're traveling and you are flying somewhere and you're landing in an airport, but you have to jump on another flight. If you don't have a lot of time, you're going to do the standard, get the sandwich from the one vendor that has probably the best quality meats, not the questionable, weird cart that you're not sure about. Then you get a meal really quick in a short period of time, and then get on your flight. If you have a lot of extra time, like, how about we just go find a different restaurant I've never been to before and I wouldn't normally pick because I got time to burn? When it comes to technical decisions, this is common because within our projects, we don't have much extra time at all. So we're always going down the exploit type path of what options we know and we can do because we've done it before. To defend against this, in your project plans, you need to build in an ability to explore. Teams do this many times by, one, having an isolated group of individuals on their team who are doing exploration. They're doing some R&D type work. They're trying to figure out what is the right option and feeding it back to the overall team through a lunch and learn session or something else of a KT. Make sure you're building this in because naturally you will not go this path. You'll continuously go down and try to just exploit what you've done before and then seem like you've kind of exhausted all your options. Another thing I think is a good way of describing when you're looking for options, when you're getting close to making decisions, is called fulcrum hunting. So in this case, if you're not familiar with what a fulcrum is, if you think about what a lever or a lever type action, there's that point at the placement in the middle, like a teeter-totter type ride in the playground, where depending on its placement, you have a different amount of energy you can push down that can get a lot more lift. The reason I like using this analogy is that when you look at options, some options try to appear as they're free, no effort, and you get results. That should be a signal that that's not true through normal economics of the no free lunch. You always have to put effort into it, but you want that effort to be low so you can also get a lot of high lift from that choice of what you're going to exert into it. But the thing you need to be mindful of is, will this continually give me high leverage later on after I make this decision? To do that, simulate using that option much further in development lifecycle. So, okay, this works great for 3 of our services we're using. We plan on having 100 services in 5 years. What would that look like? Could it still be one team managing this, or would it just be this massive multiplier of effort? Again, we're not good at predicting the future, but when you do that kind of simulation, it helps highlight core decisions you should be asking your team, is this really going to work well as we work through it in the long term? Because what the strong signal that should scare you is that if something seems like it's completely free and you don't have to do anything and you just get this great option, that's misleading. You do have to put some energy in. You want to make sure the fulcrum, that point of leverage, is in a good spot so it's not in the opposite direction. You're putting tons of force down just to get a little bit of lift. You want to get to where you put a little bit of energy down and you continue to get to high lift. Another important thing to address when you're describing your options is to worry about what we talked about earlier. All these solutions that are coming up for you to make a decision have tons and great amounts of features that you get to have. You want to seek outcomes, the results that you want to have overall, especially how it impacts the business or what you're trying to make the decision on. I need to make it easier to deploy a service in under 1 minute that we can do every day in some environment. Like, try to get something that is measurable that you can then use to compare those solution options. Can they do that? What normally comes out when you do comparisons is what's easiest. And what's easiest is if you go to any of these solutions, open source projects, or even things that you would have to buy commercially, they're great about giving you a table of features and how they compare with their competitors. And our features have more than the competitors' features. That isn't a fair assessment if you're not going to use 99% of those features when your main problem or objective that you're trying to have out of this outcome is completely missed. So just try to describe it as something that is the actual thing you're trying to achieve, because this highlights as well when you compare it across the other options that you may not take, which would be the opportunity cost of something being missed. So try to describe, when you look at the option from the problem that you've all been sharing, that's well in writing, that the group agrees on, what is the actual outcome we need from our team or for the company to be successful? So that way you can keep validating this, and you can even go back to even vendors or anyone else you're using this project with, or open source communities, to make sure that this could achieve what we're thinking it would achieve. As with all things, you want to test things in small ways. This goes in several different flavors. One, if you have a new idea of something you want to try out as an option, you want to test it in a simple, isolated way. A lot of times this is a proof of concept. Give me a week. I'll try doing something with it with this week. If I fail, I get a lot of learnings, not a lot of impact. Another way of testing something in a small way is to talk with someone about it. This is very helpful when you find out a decision is going to be made in a meeting with 10 other people. You want to meet with every one of those individuals in that meeting beforehand and test their system one thinking response when you ask them, what do you think if we did this? They'll show their emotional response very quick, like, what? You're doing what? And you're like, oh, that's really bad. Because if that's your first response, the system two thinking will then say, well, wait a minute, something is wrong here, and here's all the critical thinking questions that I have that are impacting why I think that's crazy. So one, try to test it in isolation, build the proof of concept, learn off it so that you can fail, learn quite a bit, and not worry that now I can't make that bigger decision because I've already got a good sampling how it works. But also test this by talking with your peers and people you trust before feel like you have to go in a bigger meeting and you're trying to all disagree in that technical discussion. Be mindful of going into uncharted territory. I think most engineers I've met have a good compass on this when they go somewhere and say, wait a minute, has anyone ever done this before? And then you find out, no, they haven't. I've Googled it and no one's ever done this before. That should be, wait a minute, we shouldn't be doing that. There'll probably be a few times in your career where you will have to go into uncharted territory, but normally you should find some types of comparisons of what other people have done that are similar paths and approaches you're doing. That helps validate where you're going. As well as, if you try to go that uncharted territory, you're going to pay a high tax of just trying to essentially walk through this jungle that no one else has made a path for you on, as well as you will be extremely at a disadvantage of making any predictions what you're going to do in the next week because you've never been there before, nor has anyone else. So be very cautious if you find out this option you're evaluating for a decision is something no one else has ever done before. A great way to stabilize your perspective of what is available options is seek standards and communities. I think one of the greatest things we've heard in the last couple of days at DevCon is the focus on open source, and also looking at how other companies, if you don't have an open source strategy, you're at a very big disadvantage of where you're going. But how well open source works by both having open discussions and very clear channels of the direction of where projects are going, as well as what companies are trying to also back these projects because they share this similar vision or understanding of that problem. The CNCF, or the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, is a great example of this. They highlight projects that share these kind of common problem sets, and it's a really easy way to get involved in the community, listen into design discussions, directions of where the project's going overall. Another bias that we suffer is the sunk cost fallacy. We all sometimes identify this, but be mindful that this comes up often, that since we already wrote all this code, why don't we just use it? I mean, we just reviewed it and wrote tests. We can't delete it. Something to be mindful about is that you actually negative code changes, which is a term that was kind of coined by Bill Atkinson back in 1982, was that negative code change, the deletion or retraction of code, is a positive change. You actually want to delete code. This becomes much more highlighted when you look at code more as a liability than an asset. You can't keep growing all the code that you own and have the same amount of humans, because that's not sustainable. You actually want to find ways of getting rid of code, deferring to other things to support it. Another highlight when you look at options is also no code as an option. Kelsey Hightower is a great one who's highlighted this because no code has a lot of great benefits. No code has no cost for operations, it has no defects, it has lots of things that you don't want to have. When it comes to here's the problem and what we should do, many times I've seen engineers frame it of what code do we have to implement to fix it. Focus on the problem of how can we not write any code at all, because that's the lowest cost option we can possibly have. Think of no code as a very good option. What can we use off the shelf or something else versus us writing it? When it comes to decisions, a common thing that comes up, especially with computer science, is the optimal stopping problem, or also known as the secretary problem. This is when you're trying to evaluate decisions, but it's unclear of the boundary of how many choices you may have to go through to evaluate. I bring this up because as many technical decision makers that you are, you also have to make decisions of who to hire on your team, which just gets highlighted. Through computer science, they found where the optimal point of stopping is, which is 37%. But 37% means something like this. If you're going to evaluate an option, and every option that comes towards you, you have to say yes or no to. You'll reach the optimal choice if you wait essentially into 37% of the evaluation and then make the choice that is better than anything you've seen before. For example, I will give you 3 weeks to find the best engineer to go hire. The first week of your evaluation is to assess each person, and you'll have to turn them down. Then after that first week, you must hire the very first person that is better than the people you've actually interviewed previously. This, of course, has a large disadvantage if who you've asked at the beginning, whoever you interviewed at the beginning, doesn't even get to get picked because of this. So this 37% is important to highlight, is that is the number if you can't recall an earlier option. If you can actually recall an earlier option, you should actually change that percentage quite a bit, meaning go up to like 60-some% of things you can evaluate because you can go back and actually ask. Other thing to keep in mind is when you have options you're trying to make a decision, they could turn you down. It's not like, oh great, we'll hire you, come on over. And they're like, no, I don't want to work for you now. That's when you actually want to do it much earlier. It's more like 25% if there's a 50-50 chance of making a decision. I bring this up because I found this quite interesting from a book that highlights this very point about kind of algorithms to live by, is that this also identifies how you can use this algorithm to find other things, like free parking spots, using the optimal stopping problem. How far should you actually keep driving till you should pick a spot to park? A common thing to also do, that's the generic rule that many of us like to do, is just simply delay the decision. If you don't feel like it's actually critical to make a decision, then don't make it. Sometimes people feel like they should make some decision to actually progress or to check something off the box. It's better to delay it. You will never have all the information necessary to make a decision, but if it's not critical that you have to make a decision, feel free to delay it. Because in the future, which you can't easily predict, you may not have to make the decision anymore. It might actually go away of that problem. So think that, well, one option is simply delay it. A similar aspect to this is what I call sleep on it, which is another form of delaying the decision. For whatever reason, when high critical, important decisions have to be made, it's always a meeting at the end of a day, and you have to make it with a bunch of people, and you're all exhausted, and you just want to make a decision. You're also held ransom that if you don't make the decision, you can't go home. So when these type of situations come up, do try to do this option because there's actually science backing it. If you have to make a decision, and especially at the end of the day, your brain's exhausted. It's not going to be very clear or making the best choices anyway. Many times, too, a choice you make at the end of the day can actually wait to the next morning, too. Nothing's going to happen with that choice overnight. By sleeping, you actually get to leverage what is called your unconscious mind, or essentially the non-waking part of your brain. Your unconscious mind actually can do quite a bit of work on decisions as you sleep. There's also just the basics of you can clear your mind, you wake up more refreshed, and you can make a better choice in the morning than you can in the afternoon or late afternoon. So try to leverage sleep on it, because most people will not say, no, you can't sleep on it, you gotta make a decision now. If you make a decision now, you're probably gonna regret it. Remember, emotions are your enemy. When I brought up earlier about thinking fast and slow, the systems one part of thinking is highly tied to the emotional state of your being when you make a decision. It's easy to assess when you see other people making a decision if they're happy, sad, frustrated, or whatever. It's very strong indicator if you're in a meeting where someone's upset and it's obvious, their voice is getting raised, you can see they're stressed. Do not allow them to make a decision or feel like you have to make a decision in that case, because it more likely is not going to be the best decision. Leverage the earlier option of sleep on it. Just bring up, okay, I think we've gotten down to what our options probably are. It seems like we're all favoring these kind of positions. I think we should just make our decision by tomorrow morning, and that way we can still act on that by tomorrow working day. Don't allow the emotions to dictate everything, because the times I've seen people get upset in meetings and try to make a decision, we end up just retracting that decision like a week later and have to start over again. So just be mindful of the emotions are a hard thing to change, and you normally can read people's kind of nonverbal cues when they're upset as well. Just say, wait a minute, let's not make the decision yet. I can tell you're passionate about this topic, but I don't want you to regret it or myself regretting it either. Another bias we face when it comes to these topics is the appeal to probability, which is also kind of a classic example of Murphy's Law. So with Murphy's Law, if you're not familiar with it, it's kind of like if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. Or essentially it's our mistaken assumption that if something is likely to happen, it will definitely happen. And I usually see this when decisions are proposed, if you can take this option, when that option is proposed, it's kind of propped up by saying, well, this will also prevent us from having this terrible situation happen that happened before where a zookeeper failed over because NTP wasn't working in this one network segment where it could talk back to NTP or whatever. It's a very complex situation of a failure. When those happen, it's very good to capture the failure state of what we've had before, because that's where we learn. The pain helps us remember really well, and we all have lots of pains of these issues we've had in production. But try to bring context of probability with it. So when you hear that, you're like, oh, really? That sounds really bad. Well, how many times has that happened to us since we've been running Zookeeper? They say, well, it only happened, once. Okay, how long have you been running Zookeeper? About 3 years. Okay, well, that's like 1 hour out of 26,000 hours that we've had that we've faced that. That's good to know, but let's just put a little annotation on there, because it's very easy to use this where it'll bolster an option because it seems so critical. This terrible, horrible thing could happen. The other thing to be kind of mindful of is when these options come up, you also will remember these failure modes vividly. And any other relatable thing of that failure will then map to other things. So network segments, NTP failures. In this case, when I was severely burned by this unicorn blowing flames on me, whenever I hear of another horse coming close, I think of this. I'll then see something else like, oh, DNS could fail and we have this other problem as well. Don't allow it to have it allow it to bolster beyond what it really was before. Capture it, but make sure you have context of the probability that we experience. It doesn't require a lot of math. Just say, well, when was the last time we experienced it? Let's put a little context. And ask the group too, has anyone else experienced this? If not, it sounds like it was a signal of a specific case. Let's be mindful of it, but don't fixate on it. Another thing to remember is that you're always negotiating. A lot of times when options are presented to people, they won't like the options. And so the first thing they usually do to refine the option, they go back to the person who provided it and say, hey, you gave me this option, but essentially, can you do this in 4 weeks instead of 6 with the same group of people? Usually the theme of, can I get more with less? And I usually say, people are like, are we redefining mathematics? Like, why do you think you can get more out of less? But it's usually framed in a form of a question or challenge. And as engineers, we love challenges. So then you'll say, well, you could probably do it if we actually worked the weekends and we worked a little extra and we didn't do all the tests. And then the person hearing that option would say, well, that sounds fantastic. That sounds like we got a good option to go with here. I'll catch you later. And you just negotiate away a whole bunch of stuff Be mindful that you're always negotiating and you could lose resources simply from using what you love to do, problem solving, to describe a potential that isn't really a potential. One of the other cases that is similar to this after you make a decision is a bias that we call escalation of commitment. A lot of times when you're within a group, especially when it's late in a project and things are going wrong, you'll see people kind of take this move where they're like, I'm all in, just keep going with it. Like, well, we're seeing really bad cases where it's not working well. Like, we've already made this decision, it's too late to change that. Both one with a sunk cost fallacy as well as we already are doing this, so just finish it. And you're like, what? Like, you can course correct a little bit. It doesn't have to be keep pursuing on it. So try to challenge it back with questions like, well, why does that think that's, usually describe it in safety. Why do you think the system will be more safe if we keep using this option? Because most people are like, whoa, I don't want to invade safety here. Let's talk about that then. I don't want to hurt something. Well, great, because I think safety is getting risk when we keep pursuing and saying we're all in on an option. And one thing to also keep in mind when it comes to decisions is that pretty much all of our decisions are imperfect, and imperfect decisions can work. I've seen a lot of people, when it comes back to delaying a decision, they almost get paralyzed from making any technical decisions at all because they feel like they don't have all the information at hand. You normally will never have all the information at hand to make the very perfect decision. That kind of gets highlighted with the optimal stopping problem. It isn't about getting all information, it's when can you optimally stop and still reach an effective solution. So understand that you can't always get all the information, but you can work with decisions that can go beyond what you thought they could do, as long as one is you test them small, you make them adaptable, so if you make this choice, it doesn't inhibit you from doing something in the future. An important point of this, and I have found this to work quite well now in my career, is capturing decisions in a standard way. Michael Nygaard highlights this in his own blog post about documenting architecture decisions, is about using lightweight architectural decision records, which are these ADRs. The point of it doing in this way is to centralize where you're having decisions that impact things beyond your team, the architecture and the influence, and you capture the why. Why did we decide to do that? This gives a lot of context of the decision, the time in which you're applying it, and also gives you the natural kind of information of the expiration of that decision. Oh, we made that because there wasn't an operating system that could support this? Well, now it does, so let's forget that decision, versus it becoming this tribal rule that we have to keep following, and no one else knows why we made that decision. So do follow this. It also simplifies your communication challenges. When you kind of share and merge into this, in this case, a central repository that we do called just Millennium/architecture, in that repository, we have things that we have agreed upon. They say, this is a decision we're going to work through, but hey, everyone else in these teams, just heads up, if you want to, go ahead and read this. That way you avoid some of the phone game of people re-explaining, like, I heard we made this decision, but I think Carl was stressed out when he made that decision, and there's this other critical project that's happening. No, that's not what happened. Here's why we made that decision, and here's the purpose of it. A good kind of description as well is called it lightweight. Don't make these extremely formal documentation tasks. Get enough to really describe the context and the why, and even share, we didn't have all the data at hand, and nor did we actually do a bunch of analysis on the data when we made this decision. That's really good context to share because you may come back to it and say, well, they made this decision with little data. We've got a lot more data that proves this is not really correct anymore. So now we're going to kind of summarize the things we've tried to learn. We went over some of the things of why decisions are hard. A lot of it's because we have too many options that are normally presented to us, and they're usually heavily kind of bolstered with lots of features. As technical engineers, we usually seek those options, and we find those very attractive to use. So we get lost in the options to make a decision. When we went through how, we were really focusing first on the problem at hand that we're trying to make a decision about. Try practicing some of the things of reframing the problem to make sure you're actually looking at the problem the right way, because your decisions or the choices that will be in front of you may be quite a bit different than just what you thought they were before. Also learn how to explore. Avoid that you're going to normally try to exploit all the time because you're under time constraints. So look to explore the options you want and seek large open source communities and standards like the CNCF to give you guidance of where other people are going to help validate your choice and where you're going. So this decision isn't something you're doing that you feel like, well, I don't think anyone else has made a decision for. You can find out what other large companies have done as well. To learn more about your biases, check out this app by Buster Benson. It's called Pocket Biases, and it's really fun to read about all the different biases that we have as humans or suffer from. It's not that you can normally get rid of them, but it's good to be aware of them. And also, by you attending this talk today, you have an exclusive option of getting this guide that I've made for you. If you want, it's available online. You can use the QR code to capture it. I'll also tweet it out later. It fits beautifully on 11 by 17, and it can be hosted in your home as well. Here are my references. I also have these included on the site for the guide, so if you can get hyperlinks, you want to go click and read more about it. And that's my talk, so please leave your feedback, only positive feedback, please. I'm kidding, any feedback would be great. Thank you for coming.